We're back. There's a new team in number 10, promising to change everything. It's all going to be different and better. Definitely. Well, maybe. Keir Starmer's back-to-school message this week was less D-Ream and more Morrissey. Yes, things will one day get better, but heaven knows we're all going to be miserable till then. Rachel Reeves says she's got to plug a supermassive black hole in the nation's bank account. Get ready. The taxman's standing by. At least one person in politics looks like they're having a good time. Kamala Harris elbowed Joe Biden off the dance floor. Can she relight the Democrats' fire? The new term in Parliament starts tomorrow. The government says there'll be new laws on nationalising rail, creating GB Energy. But most eyes will be on likely tax rises and spending cuts in the autumn. I'll speak to Leader of the House, Lucy Powell. It's 61 years since Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. With race and equality high on the agenda on both sides of the Atlantic, I'll be joined by the Reverend Raphael Warnock, the United States Senator for Georgia, a state that will play a pivotal role in the presidential election. The hard right in Germany could win a state election for the first time since the Nazis in the 1930s. Those elections are taking place today, and the Alternative for Deutschland party is expected to top the polls. We'll speak to the German ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger. Plus, with us throughout the show, three veteran cabinet ministers. The former acting leader of the Labour Party, Harriet, now Baroness Harman. A Conservative who's been both Trade and Defence Secretary and Chairman of the party, Sir Liam Fox. And the former Lib Dem leader and Business Secretary, Sir Vince Cable. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Dare I say it, an oasis of stability and calm in a turbulent world. The former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was once asked, what is most likely to knock a government off course? He famously replied, events, dear boy, events. Well, there are plenty of obstacles for the new Labour government to navigate. In his first weeks as Prime Minister, Keir Starmer has faced street riots, the threat of strikes by train drivers, teachers and doctors. His Chancellor warns of an economic crisis, and the small boats are still bringing hundreds across the Channel. But looking at our closest allies, maybe we shouldn't be singing the blues. The American election is increasingly raucous, bitter and divisive. In parts of Germany, an anti-immigrant, nativist, some say neo-Nazi party may tonight be voted into power in regional elections. And to top it all, our nearest neighbours, France, can't even agree who should run the country. Well, mind you, the Belgians say that they didn't have a government for 2 years, and those were the happiest 2 years of their recent history. A lot for us to get our teeth into, so let's start with government. The Leader of the House of Commons, Lucy Powell, joins us from Salford. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Trevor.
Can we just start with the Grenfell inquiry, which reports this week? We've recently seen renewed concern over fire in a tower block in Dagenham. Will the government commit to accepting the Grenfell inquiry report's recommendations?
Well, the Grenfell inquiry is reporting next week, as you know, and Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, will be responding to that when we see it. And of course, the government will look extremely closely at that inquiry, and we want to see the truth. We want to see the truth of what happened and lessons learned, and we will take incredibly seriously the findings of that inquiry. And I don't think it would be right for us to sort of preempt that at this stage, but you can be assured that the government will respond fully and take on board that inquiry findings.
Okay, thank you. Now, you've published a pretty busy legislative programme. One item, is it your intention to legislate to prevent people smoking in the open air?
Well, as you say, we've got a packed legislative agenda, which we set out in our first King's Speech just before recess. More bills announced in that packed agenda than any other incoming comparable government of recent times, and we've already got to work in delivering that, introducing a number of bills before recess, second reading of those bills. Some will complete their common stages next week on rail franchising, on fiscal responsibility, introducing second reading of Great British Energy so that we can keep people's bills lower over the long term, and we've got many more things to come on renters' rights, on employment rights, on tackling water bosses' bonuses.
Yes.
And one of the things that we will be introducing, as was in that King's Speech, was the smoking and vaping bill, as you described, that came from the previous government. Because
yes.
I think there has been a consensus for a long time now that we want to see a smoke-free country, because the health benefits of that and the benefits to our economy of a smoke-free country and a smoke-free generation are huge, and that's why it's something that we'll be working towards.
OK. OK, well, I'm taking that to mean that you are working pretty rapidly towards a situation where people cannot smoke, for example, in pub gardens. The hospitality industry's representatives have said pretty clearly this is going to kill their businesses. After all, if you can't smoke in a pub garden, you might as well just get a keg and take it back to your flat and invite your mates around. Can you explain how attacking an industry that employs hundreds of thousands of people is going to contribute to growth, which you said is your central objective?
Well, look, we're certainly not attacking the hospitality industry. We support the hospitality industry. It's vital to our communities, our high street, our economy, as you say. And look, I mean, I'm not going to preempt what is or isn't going to be in a future piece of legislation. But what I would say is that any such measures to extend some of these issues around smoking will be done in full consultation with business, with hospitality business. We will work incredibly closely about how we would tackle such issues and implement any such measures should they come forward, and the hospitality industry can be assured of that. And that's what we did when we banned smoking in public places indoors in the last Labour government, which actually has led, all evidence showed that actually led to an increase in people attending pubs at the time.
But what they are wondering about, and what I'm asking you about, is the idea that you would ban smoking in the open air. And from what you have just said, it seems to me that you're pretty clear that you are moving to that outcome. Is that correct?
Well, look, as I've said to you, we've got a piece of legislation that's still being developed, that's mainly based on the legislation that was brought in by the previous Conservative government, because there has been this consensus for some time that we want to get to a situation where people no longer smoke, and that's why increasing the age at which you can buy cigarettes is a key part of that. We also want to tackle this scourge of vaping, by the way, which is real blight for many.
We know about the
people.
past measures, but I'm really just asking you about what you plan in relation to smoking in the open air. Are you in favour of banning that or not? Well,
as I say, should any such measures come forward in the future, and we are looking at different ways that we can achieve this collective ambition that I think we have, I'm sure everybody shares, because the deaths that come from smoking, 80,000 deaths that come from smoking, the impacts on the health service, not just from deaths, but from cancer and other diseases, the impact on the economy, on people's lives, people's ability to work. You know, these are really big issues that we need to tackle. But I can assure the hospitality industry and you that any such measures would be designed and would be implemented and would be considered in full consultation with licensing authorities and with businesses, and we will work together if we want to bring forward such measures.
OK, so that's clear, that's in the prospect. Can I ask you about one other thing which you actually you've made a decision about, and that is that there will be a budget at the end of October, and the Chancellor has already said that she won't raise national insurance rates for working people. Can I just get you to be precise about that? Does that mean that you will keep both employee contributions and employer contributions at the current rate? Or does the Chancellor's pledge only mean that she will not raise rates on what the employee pays, but what the employer pays may still change?
Well, look, what we said in the election and what we stand by is that we won't be raising income tax, we won't be raising VAT, and we won't be raising national insurance. But as you say, we've got a big budget coming at the end of this month. Those matters are for the Chancellor. I'm not involved in those discussions, as you would expect that I wouldn't be at this stage. But we are facing a difficult situation. Look, we were elected on a mandate of change, and as I've been laying out, we are delivering that change through our legislative agenda. But we do face a difficult economic situation, and the Chancellor will be making
that's very helpful.
Those judgments herself.
What I understand from what you've just said is that neither employee contributions nor employer contributions will go up. Can I ask you about one other thing? The motoring group, the RAC, has called on government to reverse Rishi Sunak's 2022 cut in fuel duty, which is, I think, 5 pence, costs the Treasury about £2 billion a year. The RAC says that the energy companies aren't passing on the cut, and so motorists don't benefit. The energy companies are taking it as profit. Is that on the table?
I don't know is the honest answer, because I'm not involved in the budget decisions. You wouldn't expect me to come onto your programme and speculate about a budget, because I would be purely speculating. These are matters for the Chancellor. She has done an incredible job in a very short period of time looking at the country's finances, and what she's found is appalling. And to just take the metaphor that you started off at the beginning of your programme with your Manchester music references, don't look back in anger. I'm afraid we do look back in anger at what the last government left to this government in the economic inheritance. And now we're faced with some really challenging choices that we didn't want to have to make.
We will come to Oasis before the end of this interview, if we may. Well, let me ask you about a decision that she's already made, which is to means test the winter fuel payment. When the Prime Minister said this week, those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burden, was he talking about the 10 million pensioners who will lose that allowance?
Well, look, this is an example of one of the very difficult decisions that we've had to make, that we didn't want to make, that we weren't wanting to do when we got elected.
Well, you didn't have to make it.
Yes, we did, because
you didn't have to make this decision. And I'm really asking you. If these people who will lose that allowance are part of what the Prime Minister means as those with the broadest shoulders, those 10 million pensioners.
Well, I think it is really important for people to understand the context. What we found was that spending was much higher in this year, the current year that we are in, the deficit much higher, debt much higher than anybody had thought. There was a black hole of 22 billion, which was made up of things like nearly £7 billion underfunding on the asylum system that the previous government knew was there. They knew they had these things on their desk, and they put their head in their sand, and they didn't take the difficult decisions they needed to take, because they knew they were going to lose the election and it was going to fall to us to do. And that's why we've had to make some of these really difficult decisions around means testing the winter payment, so that the poorest pensioners continue to receive it, but some of the wealthiest pensioners won't. And we also are committed to the triple lock, which is going to see and has already seen pensions increase, and that means that pensions will increase by either average wages or inflation or 2%, whichever is the higher. And that's going to mean that pensioners, the state pension is going to increase by hundreds, if not thousands of pounds over the course of this Parliament.
If I may say so, though, you are now government. You made a choice, and the first choice you've made was to withdraw the allowance from pensioners. In the same way as you've chosen to hand out pay increases way above inflation, while you've been telling mothers with 3 children that they'll have to wait until you found the money to lift the benefit cap. These are your choices.
Look, as I say, finding in-year savings in the current year that you are in is very difficult indeed. And why we had to do that was because if we didn't, we would have seen the markets losing confidence, potentially a run on the pound, the economy crashing. And the people who pay the heaviest price for that are not you and me, Trevor. The people who pay the heaviest price when the economy crashes are the poorest in society that do that. And people like pensioners who are on fixed incomes who see the value of their pension.
But the first thing you've done is withdraw £300 from those pensioners.
So we had to take, we've means tested the winter fuel payment, and that means we've had to take some of those difficult decisions, as you say, and it's not what we wanted to do. And in terms of the public sector pay, don't forget that these pay awards were on the desks of ministers before the election, and they chose not to budget for them, even though they knew they were going to accept them.
OK, can I ask you about an issue of standards? We've been hearing about the Labour MP, who is said to be the largest landlord in the House of Commons, who owns properties that appear to be a health hazard, apparently failed to register them. That's all alleged. Now, not far from where you are, 4 years ago, a 2-year-old boy, Awad Ishak, died from respiratory conditions brought on by living in a damp and mouldy home in Rochdale. Angela Rayner, the housing minister, says there is no justification for letting private landlords off the hook for resolving mould and damp issues. What are you going to do about Mr. Aswal?
Well, look, on him in particular, as I understand it, he himself is furious because he didn't know that this was happening in his housing stock, and he's taken immediate steps to put that right, and that's absolutely as it should be. But you are absolutely right that we need to take on the scourge of the sort of bad landlord and the impact that has on those living in the private rented sector in poor quality, insecure housing. And that's why we've been working at pace over the summer to bring forward the Renters Reform Bill, which will be coming to Parliament very shortly. It is a much strengthened bill from what we saw in the last under the last government, which will bring into effect the so-called Arabs law. I think it's really important to say that
if this had been a Conservative Member of Parliament and we had been discussing this morning, I don't believe that we would be hearing that he's decided to fix it, that's as it should be. Would you not be saying now that there should be a standards inquiry, the whip should be withdrawn, and as I think one of your colleagues has said, he should resign?
Well, look, I take at face value what he said in the last few days, and he's got to put that right. He's absolutely got to put those things right, and that's why he sacked the managing agent. But I'm not here to defend his actions. I think what was different under the Conservative government, I think it's a really important point here, is that they had many landlords on their benches who worked as a caucus to actually weaken the proposals on tenants' rights and the Renters Reform Bill. Whereas we've got an incredibly strong policy, and we will stand up to rogue landlords, and we will bring in, for the first time in a generation, some really strong rights for tenants, including on standards and safety.
Sorry to interrupt you. I know you've got to go. I take it you've got your Oasis tickets. Where do you stand on your colleague Zara Sultana's suggestion that Ticketmaster should be nationalised?
I don't think we need to nationalise Ticketmaster, but thankfully, after hours of waiting, like many other people in a queue, I was able to get a couple of Oasis tickets, but at a bit more than I was hoping to pay for them. But anyway.
Lucy Powell, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the former acting leader of the Labour Party, Harriet, now Baroness Harman, the Conservative who's been both Trade and Defence Secretary and Chairman of the party, Sir Liam Fox, and the former Lib Dem leader and Business Secretary, Sir Vince Cable. I feel intimidated to be in such distinguished company this morning. But anyway, before we come back to Lucy Powell, you were all there the last time in the House of Commons, the last time Labour replaced the Conservatives, 1997. How much does this feel like that, Harriet?
Well, very like that, and I think there's been a lot of reinterpretation of history with people thinking that in 1997 it was all cool Britannia and parties in number 10 and everybody was heaving with optimism. I mean, you'll remember we got elected in 1997 making a very solemn promise that we wouldn't put up income tax and that we wouldn't spend more in each government department than the Conservatives had planned to spend in that government department. So we had two very, very difficult and tight years to set things right before we actually built for the future, which is very like what Keir Starmer's doing now. But people have forgotten all the hard bits at the start of 1997 and just remember where it all went once we built the solid foundations.
Liam, same for you?
Well, you know, some things are similar, some things are different. What's different is that Tony Blair himself was very popular. Labour got a much bigger share of the popular vote. Unlike this time, where Keir Starmer, the polls tell us, is already not very popular, and Labour got only 34% of the popular vote. So there is a difference, I think, in the natural authority of the government. That, of course, leads on to how easy it is to keep the party together in Parliament. I also think there are very big differences in our political culture from that time, and we were musing earlier that, you know, we didn't have mobile phones and the internet and social media and all the things that we take for granted in the political environment that we have today. It will be a different parliament from that sort of parliament. The similarities, of course, are you've got lots of people coming in, ministers who've got no experience at all because they've been in opposition for 13 years. And, of course, you've still got ex-government ministers who think they're still ministers and probably think they matter a lot more than they actually do. Oh, of course, you don't expect me to do that. But there's a natural transition period, which there will be. And this government, unlike the Labour government coming in, have actually made a rod for their own backs by adding about 14 billion to public pay settlements, which won't be a one-off. It will be part of a recurrent cost.
I want to come back to all of that in a second. Let's talk about policy. Vince, you were a newbie at that time. How does it strike you?
I don't feel it's remotely similar. There was then a genuine, I think, optimism. The country was in a reasonably good shape and going to get better. I think the parallel is 2010. Where a new government came in and inherited a very big problem because the previous government, quite rightly, had to bail out the banking system and the country from terrible grief, and a lot of painful decisions to be made. This time, governments come in inheriting the problems of the COVID pandemic and the cost of living crisis, Ukraine, which added massively to deficits and debt. I mean, these are not tribal points. I mean, you've got governments coming in with a massive inherited economic problem, and it's going to require painful decisions, notably higher tax. I think in 2010, the public were better prepared for that than they have been this time.
I want to come back to the issue of the budget in a second, but today's issue seems to be this question of the plan to ban, or the floated plan to ban smoking in the open air. Harriet, given what the government's saying about how terrible and difficult everything is, do you think this should be a priority? Is this an issue? I mean, Lucy Powell seemed to be saying, actually, this is on their agenda.
Well, I think there's been a long trend, and as Lucy Powell pointed out, there's been a consensus amongst the parties over decades that we need, there's no upside, there's no safe level of smoking, and we need to do what we can to protect future generations from getting into the habit of smoking and the damage it causes to the individual, let alone to the economy. So I think that all the arguments I'm hearing now about why it's right to let people to continue to smoke in pub gardens or on terraces outside restaurants and bars are exactly the sort of arguments that were put when we banned smoking inside pubs and inside restaurants, and actually the industry adjusted to it and people adjusted to it. So I just think I'm very much in favour. She has, as you emphasised, we've got to take people with us, but we've still got to keep on making progress and not drop the ball on this.
This would have dropped on your desk when you were at Department of Trade and Industry, wouldn't it, Vince?
Yeah, I think the issue here is it's partly about a rather clumsy way of dealing with what is a genuine problem, and I agree with Harriet's basic approach to this, but I can't understand why they haven't just sort of phased out tobacco sales. You could have done that. We've started with young people. If you look at things like petrol and diesel cars, they just can't be sold in a few years' time. You're going to have to get an alternative. We could have just gradually phased out tobacco
Well, that was
sales.
a Sunak proposal, wasn't it?
Yeah, just phase it out and you don't discriminate against the hospitality industry.
We're going to do that as well. This is an add-on that's being discussed. I think, as much pace as we can put in this, the better. I mean, I speak as somebody who used to smoke and can still feel the twinge of the old addiction. And, I wish I'd never have been in the situation of getting into that position.
But we're talking about the impact on the hospitality industry here, Liam, aren't we?
Yeah, I don't think that these proposals will do anything to reduce smoking prevalence in the country, but they will affect the hospitality industry. I think this is the question.
Didn't you used to be a doctor, Liam?
Yes.
He's a doctor.
That's what I'm saying. I don't think it will do anything to reduce the prevalence of smoking. I think what it will do is it will damage the hospitality industry. There was a consensus in the last Parliament about how we took forward plans to reduce smoking in the population over time. This is not part of them. I don't know where this came from, but if your argument is that the economy is sitting on a precipice, the last thing you want to do is take any measures which will make it worse in the short term. I don't really quite understand where this came from, unless it's, to use the term, it's a smokescreen.
Very good. Let's talk about the issues of this alleged £22 billion black hole. Vince, is the Chancellor going to have to raise taxes?
Yes, and we should have been talking about it. I mean, all parties were too silent about this before the election, and we should have been much more open about it. And there is this sort of illusion that somehow Britain is an undertaxed, overtaxed country. I mean, we've certainly, at high levels relative to where we were in the Second World War, relative to other countries, many European countries, have much higher levels of tax. And if we want decent public services, we're going to have to pay for them.
Indeed, we can actually, as you probably know, we like a chart on this programme. And in fact, we've got a chart somewhere that will show us exactly that. But there was at one point some danger that you might have become Chancellor. If you had to make a choice here, Vince, what tax would you choose?
Well, amongst the big taxes, I think value-added tax, we had to put this up back in 2010. It was unavoidable. I think where the government is going to go, and actually rightly, is capital, because a lot of people have enjoyed big improvements in capital gains because of the housing boom, so they're going to go for inheritance tax, maybe reforming council tax and then increasing it. I mean, those are the things that I think are going to happen.
Yeah. OK. Well, in fact, you can see it here. Relatively speaking, actually, we are quite a low tax by comparison, for example, with the French. We'll come back to this at the end of the programme. I want to talk about whether...
Well, Denmark's over 50%.
To what extent you can be low tax and high services. But looking at the Chancellor's choices now, Liam Fox, what would you be advising her?
Well, first of all, when we talk about tax rates, what you're looking at there, and you're just in that chart, didn't look at what tax rates meant in terms of the growth league table of countries. And if you put taxes up, you're going to get less economic activity.
These are all countries, by the way, with similar levels of GDP per head.
But not similar levels of growth. In the current, for example, the United States is very much higher than France at the top of the table. So, but we can come back to that argument. The government have actually made a rod for their own back. They've added 14 billion to the cost of the public pay bill. It risks a wage price spiral, something we've not talked about since way back in the 1970s. And these will be recurrent costs because these will be the baseline for the public pay awards next year and the year after and the year after. So there's a problem here. There's no excuse, and I think the previous government carries some responsibility here for having the size of government bigger than it was pre-pandemic. The government should have brought the size of government back down to that and below, because you cannot keep on increasing the size of government and expect your economy to grow in the way our competitors do.
We've got to go to the 9 o'clock, but just briefly, Harriet, is she going to have to raise taxes, do you think?
Well, she's already said that she is going to raise some taxes. For example, she's going to get rid of the VAT allowance for private schools. She's going to make sure that non-DOMs pay their fair share of tax. She's going to also make sure that the energy companies pay on the windfall profits that they've got. So she's going to be revenue raising, but she says she's not going to increase the taxes on working people who are struggling. OK,
well, we'll come back to some of that later on in our programme. It is now approaching 9 o'clock in the morning. We have talked to the leader of the House of Commons, Lucy Powell, and she has told us, amongst other things, that though the government will stick to its plan in relation to national insurance, employers' national insurance will not go up, neither will employees' national insurance. I think that we are, in a moment, going to go to our colleague Alistair Bunkle in the Middle East, if we have the opportunity, to talk about what has been happening in Israel overnight. There is news now that we have seen some new hostages. Alistair, what is the situation there now?
Good morning, Trevor. Well, the early hours of this morning, the Israeli military released a statement confirming that yesterday they'd recovered the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages in a tunnel in the south of Gaza, in the Rafah area. They say that the hostages were killed by Hamas. We assume they have done forensic examinations to lead them to that conclusion. And they believe that the hostages could have been recovered alive. They think that Israeli soldiers were less than a kilometre away from where these hostages were being held, but they were murdered by Hamas before Israeli forces had an opportunity to reach them. Hamas has released a statement this morning blaming Israel, saying that it is because Israel has refused to agree or take part in serious ceasefire negotiations that these 6 died. They are 6 young men and women, all below the age of, the eldest was 32, so most of them in their 20s. They were assumed by most to have been alive. The hope was that they would be part of a hostage deal and they would come out of Gaza almost a year into their ordeal, but alive to be reunited with their families. That will not happen. Israel is in shock. The fate of all hostages is well known to everybody here. There are protests regularly every single week, often more than once a week, to call for their return to come home. And there'll be protests across Israel today, late afternoon and into the evening, still calling for a hostage deal, but there will be focus directed at Benjamin Netanyahu because there is growing anger, certainly amongst the hostage families, but also amongst the security establishment, that Netanyahu appears to be prioritising a military campaign over a potential hostage deal.
So what is the mood, do you think, about following this? Clearly, this has been an extraordinarily traumatic moment for Israel. Do you think that we are now beginning to see the unwinding of the situation, or is this just another horrible step along the road?
Well, I'll unpick various layers of that. In Gaza itself, we have now seen, I think, in excess of 10 hostages recovered by the IDF in the last 2.5 weeks, of which one, Farhan al-Qadi, a Bedouin man, was found alive. The others were found dead. I think it's no mistake that 11 months now into this war, Israel has degraded Hamas significantly. It is dismantling its tunnels systematically, and in doing so, it is starting to find increasing numbers of hostages where they were being held by Hamas. But there is no hostage deal, and a lot of people, including the defense minister, no less, in Israel, feel that Netanyahu, as I say, feels it is more important to keep Israeli forces in Gaza against Hamas's demands than it is to have a hostage deal. And I think that anger will be focused and manifest itself later today.
Alistair, thank you very much. Keep us posted. Well, one of the hostage, Hirsch Goldberg Polin, was an American citizen. The American president, Joe Biden, said that he was devastated and outraged to hear of his death. I'm joined now by the United States Senator from Georgia, Reverend Raphael Warnock, who's in London to deliver a sermon right after this programme on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. We'll discuss those themes of race and equality that still loom large over the United States in a moment, as well as on this side of the Atlantic. But first, Senator, can I get your reaction to the news from the Middle East?
Well, of course, it's heart-wrenching and heartbreaking. We send out our prayers to the family of all of the hostages and this American hostage, and we pray for peace.
I want to come back to the issue of, or if you like, the position of the candidate that you're supporting, obviously, for President Kamala Harris in this area in a moment. But let's start by talking about why you're here. It's 61 years since Dr. King made a speech on the steps of the Lincoln Monument. Why is this still relevant to our times?
Well, 60 years ago, Dr. King actually preached here at the St. Paul's Cathedral, and I was invited to come and preach in honor of that moment. I serve as a United States Senator from the state of Georgia, honored to represent the people of that state. But before I came to the Senate, I served as pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. I still serve there, where Dr. King preached. But these issues around justice and building what Dr. King called the beloved community, of pulling together the various strands of our humanity so that we might live in peace, whether we're talking about justice and peace in the United States, in the UK, in Israel, among Palestinians and Israelis. Dr. King's message of nonviolence, of truth-telling, and of justice-making is as relevant today as it was 60 years ago.
But of course, at the heart of what we think of in relation to Dr. King, though, as you say, his agenda broadened towards the end of his life, was the issue of race. And it's not always obvious from this side of the Atlantic why race takes such precedence in American life and still does, given that many of the political leaders of the United States are African-American, all sorts of barriers have been broken through. You yourself are an example of that. You're the first black senator from the South. Why is race such a prevalent and divisive issue in the United States?
What we're witnessing right now, backlash in our country. You're right. We've had an African-American, we've had a black president. We've got Kamala Harris, who's the nominee. But I think it's important that one is aware of the complicated history of the American story. This is a country that allowed me, a kid who grew up in public housing, to serve in the United States Senate. I was elected on January 5th, first black senator from Georgia, alongside John Ossoff, first Jewish senator from Georgia. The very next day, we witnessed a violent insurrection that was instigated by the current president, driven by the big lie that somehow this election had been stolen. Behind that lie was an even bigger lie that this emerging multiracial American electorate does not get to decide the future of the country. So in a real sense, like all families, the American family has a complicated story, and we continue to push towards our ideals, and that is a country that embraces all of us.
You're supporting Vice President Harris in this election, and I think everybody reckons that your state, Georgia, is probably the most crucial state in what's going to be a close election. How close is it in Georgia itself?
It's very close, and it's going to be a tight race. Georgia did an amazing thing when it elected me to the United States Senate. My race alongside that of the other United States Senator from Georgia, John Ossoff, literally flipped the Senate, which then opened the door for us to get
Previous to that, the
amazing
Republicans
things that
were in
we've done.
control of the Senate.
That's true. And we flipped the Senate. But Georgia is going to be crucial. I often say that the road to the White House goes right through Georgia, and I'm going to be doing everything I can to get Kamala Harris elected.
Well, let's talk about Vice President Harris. She's not the best-known figure in this country, and there are many things we don't actually know about what she thinks. One specific question is, she hasn't spoken about when she knew of President Biden's apparent cognitive decline and how much she knew. She is going to have to say something about that before election day, isn't she?
I push back against the premise. The president is serving as president. He's doing just fine. He made a decision based on the input that he'd been receiving. He made a decision to move aside and allow for someone else to be the standard bearer for the.
But surely that input was largely because of doubt about his capacity to perform.
Joe Biden is doing just fine, and he has been one of the most consequential presidents in my lifetime. We're talking about the first gun safety bill passed in 30 years. After many presidents promised to do so, he got it done. Donald Trump spent almost every week of his presidency talking about infrastructure week. Joe Biden finally got it done. We did massive investments, not only in infrastructure, but the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest investment in clean energy and a clean energy future in human history.
I want to come back to Mr. Trump in a second, but can I just ask you one other question? We were talking a moment ago about what's happening in the Middle East. What can we expect from a President Harris? If, for example, if she's elected, will she continue arms shipments to Israel?
I think she has stated clearly, and far be it for me to speak on behalf of who I believe will be the next president of the United States. She has indicated that she stands by Israel's right and ability to defend itself in a very dangerous neighborhood, a very dangerous part of the world. We are witnessing that right now. Our hearts continue to go out for the hostages. October 7th was a terrible and devastating day for the people of Israel. She has indicated that she stands by the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination, and that a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace with their Middle East neighbors, that is the North Star. If getting there were easy, we'd be there by now.
I want to come back to the issue of race in just a second, but can I just ask you about God? Donald Trump says this week that God saved him from the assassination attempt. You probably have a more direct line to the Almighty than I do. What are you hearing on that claim?
I'm praying that God, in partnership with us, this November 5th will save us from Donald Trump.
Let's come back to the reason that you're here, that you're going to be talking about issues of race. We're going to see, it looks like, what is described as a neo-Nazi party coming to power in at least one part of Germany. We're seeing the rise of anti-immigrant parties across Europe. And of course, you in the United States have your issues about the border and immigration is a big issue. What lessons can we draw from your experience about the divisiveness of race, I guess, still in the modern world?
Listen, we have to be vigilant in building what Dr. King called the beloved community. And he often said that the real danger is not, what he called the children of darkness and those who are, we know who these people are. We know who the neo-Nazis are and all of these far right-wing groups that put forward a kind of view of humanity that is nativistic, that is xenophobic. The question is, those of us who believe in peace, who believe in human dignity, what are we going to do to move that forward? And so that's the work that I try to do every single day as a United States Senator. It is why I try to put forward legislation that affirms the dignity of poor people, that provides a path for people that leads to human fulfillment. I wouldn't be sitting here if it were not for the voice and the moral courage, not only of Martin Luther King Jr., but of the multiracial coalition of conscience that he was able to pull together. Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, two Jews and an African American who literally lost their lives fighting for voting rights. Viola Luiso, a white woman who lost her life fighting for voting rights and for civil rights. And it is that kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational coalition of conscience that we need as we push back against the autocratic forces that are trying to put forward a certain agenda in Europe and all across the globe.
Reverend Warnock, thank you so much for your time this morning. I'm sorry I can't get to your sermon, but I will no doubt read it.
We will pray for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that presidential election in the United States is just 2 months away now, and the best place to watch it, of course, will be here on Sky News.
I say, bring it on.
With America divided and tensions running high, get ready for an election like no other.
Join our teams as we follow the campaign trail as America decides.
We will win, win, win.
Get closer to the action this US election with full reaction and analysis.
Sky News, the full story first.
Right, let's take a closer look at that fight for the White House then. I want to give you a sense of how the race has changed since Kamala Harris took over from Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate. Now, you might remember this chart from our last show before the summer break. These 7 swing states, as they're called, were all pivotal to Joe Biden's win in 2020. A month ago, Donald Trump was leading in 5 of them. Let's look at the situation now. That red map suddenly becomes a blue map. It's still all within the margin of error in Nevada and Pennsylvania and Arizona, but it's now Kamala Harris leading in 5 states. Donald Trump actually hangs on in Georgia, which we've just been talking about. But look at Minnesota. Harris is now leading by 9 points. That's the home state of her vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz. Our panel joins me again. Liam, what difference do you think it will make if Kamala Harris were able to turn this around and defeat Trump?
I'm not sure it would make very much difference in terms of American policy. It would be much a continuation of the Biden administration. I think what the Democrats will worry about with these figures is they look very similar to the figures that Hillary Clinton had before she was defeated by Donald Trump. And in the states that will really matter, and I would single out Pennsylvania, it is really very, very tight and will go to the wire, this election. And having just come back from Washington last weekend, I think the thing that will go unresolved in the United States is this intensely bitter tribal nature of American politics. I remember, because I knew John McCain very well, sitting in John's office. And
the Republican candidate in 2000.
Yes, and I remember saying to John, this was in 2009,
right.
I remember saying, it seems to me that there are people on both sides of the aisle now in Congress who would rather see America fail than see their opponents succeed, which strikes me as very un-American. And he said to me, well, I wish I could tell you that you were wrong. And it seems to me that that tribal nature of American politics has actually deepened and worsened in that time. That will be the most important thing for any American president to deal with, because it's not just the racial problems, as you've just described, that are there, but there are very deep-seated political and social problems to be dealt with.
Harriet, do you worry that we borrow that tribalism?
Well, it's not so much tribalism, but I think that it matters enormously to us that Trump shouldn't get elected, because, I mean, for two reasons in particular. One, because he undermines democracy. Anybody who cares about democracy all around the world, many people are struggling for democracy. He undermines trust and confidence in it. He attacks his own democracy, as well as casting a blight on everybody else's. But also, there's a kind of virus of misogyny that he sends out that legitimises the idea of how women are to be treated badly and are unequal. I mean, look at his vice president, for example. And that spreads through the internet, through social media, and affects young boys and girls in this country as well. So I think it matters enormously. But I think in relation to Kamala Harris, and it's different from Hillary Clinton, is because one of the things that Hillary Clinton never managed to do, which hopefully it looks as though Kamala Harris is doing, is energising her base. And that was what was lacking whilst Biden was potentially the candidate, energising the Democrat base. So that gives me hope.
Vince?
I think we need to be clear about why this matters to us. I mean, we're not Americans. They choose their own president, make their own preferences. I mean, it matters to us in several ways. That, I mean, Trump potentially throwing a grenade into traditional alliances that matters for us in Europe, but Japan, Korea and others. It matters because he would tear up the international agreement on climate change, which is, existential, enormously important. He's trading up the rules on international trade, which is the basis of our prosperity in the long run. So it matters to us because we're foreigners and because his stance on all these big international issues is so disastrous.
OK. All right, next. The far right in Germany could win a state election for the first time since the Nazis in the 1930s. We'll go live to where people are voting right now, and we'll speak to the German ambassador here.
Yeah, currently in England, at least, we've had some illegal beaver releases, but we've legalised one of them at least on the River Otter down in Devon, and the Devon Wildlife Trust worked for many years on the Devon Beaver project to look at how we can bring beavers back into that, and I've shown a way of doing that. And we're now calling on government to really bring beavers back to all of the lakes and rivers of Britain. And we're asking Natural England and Natural Resources Wales to come up with some sensible and proportionate licensing regime to allow that to happen, because beavers are really special animals. Well, I think government's just got a bit stalled, and it really needs to think about the advantages of beavers. And, we know that the beaver, the activities of beavers create these, through their damming, through their coppicing, through creating ditches, they create these fabulous wetlands that really are massively full of wetland wildlife, dragonflies and damselflies, toads, frogs and toads. So this is exactly the sort of thing that we want to see as we restore nature across Britain. Of course, beavers do this pretty much for free, but they also slow the flow. So instead of storing water in floodwaters in our front rooms, we can store water in beaver wetlands much more safely. So they're natural flood engineers. They're doing that service for free. Even better, they're also reducing water pollution. So as the water runs through these beaver wetlands, through the dams, through the wetland vegetation, it cleans up the water. So they're also creating effectively natural water treatment works. So they're also our cuddliest mammal, they've got the densest fur. So our cuddliest mammal are nature restorers, flood engineers, water treatment work supervisors, and just be fantastic to have them back. So we need to get on with that. So the government it's a great thing to do. It's virtually for free, and we need to get that moving in government again now.
The hard right in Germany could win a state election for the first time since the Nazis in the 1930s. Germans are voting as we speak, and the Alternative for Germany, or AfD party, is expected to top the polls in at least one state. So what would it mean for democracy in Europe's biggest economy and the rise of populists across the continent? In a moment, I'll be joined here in London by Germany's ambassador to the UK. But first, our Europe correspondent is on the ground in Erfurt, Thuringia. Morning, Siobhan. What is the mood there?
Hi, Trevor. Well, the polls are open. People are casting their votes, but it's really interesting because here in Thuringia and in neighbouring Saxony, there are just over around 5 million Germans who will be going to cast their votes today. And here in Thuringia, it is predicted that there could be a landslide for the far-right AfD party. If that happens, as you say, this would be the first time since the Nazis that a far-right party could get the most seats in a state parliament. And why this vote is really important and is really catching the eye, not just of German media, but media around the world, is because it's being seen as something of a temperature-taking exercise for the national government, which has become deeply unpopular in some areas because it's been marred by infighting. So topics which are feeding into support of the AfD here. We went to an AfD rally and people were talking about immigration. So concerns around immigration. We know that after 2015-16 that Germany had an open door policy, took in around 1 million refugees at that period. They also took in around 1 million following the war in Ukraine. And many Germans feel like there's just too many people coming in. So they support the AfD party because they feel that that's a party that's traditionally very anti-immigration. Also, you'll remember a week ago there was an alleged terror attack in Solingen, and the suspect who is being charged with that attack was allegedly a failed asylum seeker. So that as well is feeding into that debate. Other concerns which people talk to me about is something that we're hearing across Europe, this feeling that mainstream political parties simply aren't listening to them. They don't reflect what they need. So they're looking for alternatives either on the right or the left. And it's interesting actually here in both Thuringia and in Saxony where people are voting, there's a new party which is far left, which has only been developed this year, and that's also expected to garner a lot of votes. So this is an important vote, not just for the states here, but also for the general election, which will happen in Germany in the next year or so.
Siobhan, thank you so much. We'll no doubt be listening to your reports as the day goes by. Good morning, Ambassador. You are no doubt observing this very, very carefully. Could we just start by explaining why these elections are so significant?
They are significant because we have this year 3 regional elections in East Germany, and they will be one of the major tests before we have general elections September next year.
And are these particular states very significant because they're populous or because they are, if you like, a weather vane? Or is it simply that they're a pointer to what might happen next year?
No, I think they are, somehow they represent obviously a trend which we are seeing not only in Germany but all over Europe. You just had the senator from the US speaking about the division within his country. We see a growing discontent, and this discontent, what the Prime Minister called snake oil populism, is everywhere. And it's reflected now in these state elections in East Germany. And as your colleague rightly said, we might see for the first time, let's wait for the results, but we might see it for the first time, a far-right party winning a state election. But Trevor, I think it's very important to underline, in German politics, we have what we call a firewall. Firewall means nobody cooperates with the far right. So they will not gain power. They will be isolated. It will not be easy to form a coalition around them. But this is definitely the willingness of the other parties.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I wonder if you could just explain. I mean, these people they're not compelling people to vote for them. What is the appeal here? Is it what Siobhan was talking about, purely the issue of migration and so on, the 2015 migration from the Middle East?
First, I would say it's not a phenomenon only of East Germany. We have the AfD also in Western Germany, but they are stronger in the East. And there are some phenomena which have to do, for example, with 40 years of communism, that people don't feel as affiliated as in the West to the traditional parties. We have problems in rural areas. We have a sentiment of migration, which many feel is too strong. Criminality has increased. So there are many factors which are feeding in to this sentiment. The war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, all of this is creating a feeling that the life has become more complicated, that maybe the situation of their sons and daughters will not be as good as their own situation. So all of that feeds in. But we should not forget, more than half of the people don't vote the extremes because they know that politics is complicated and requires long-term solutions. And this is the day-to-day fight we need to have.
You spoke of this firewall. Well, actually, I think they tried this to some extent in France against Le Pen. They tried it in the Netherlands. One has to say that actually the tactic seems to fail because parties like the AfD are in government in Sweden, in Italy. In fact, they run the government in Italy, Denmark, and probably will be in the Netherlands. Is there a danger that the lineup of, let's call it, the traditional, conventional parties simply emphasises the message from these radical right parties? You see, they're all against you, the people. They're not listening to you, and they are going to all get together simply to stop your voice being heard.
Now, my personal feeling is we should stop, calling the voters neo-Nazis. These are people who protest with their vote. So we have to take this serious, and we have to try to address that. And, Trevor, we just had some days ago a very successful visit of the Prime Minister to Berlin. They spoke about an action plan. Yes, about the British Prime Minister in Berlin, action plan on migration. But he spoke also about this snake-oil populism, and we have to deliver. I think delivery is the key issue. How can we win back the protest vote? Only by delivery. And this is what needs to be strengthened. And I would put this really in the broader context of the reset of the United Kingdom in its relationship towards the European Union. It's about Ukraine, it's about our bilateral relationship, but it's also about strengthening delivery.
Well, one of the things that people have been talking about in that relationship is the question of mobility. And one of the discussions that seems to be taking place in the background is whether it might be possible to introduce some sort of mobility scheme for young people so that young people can come from Germany, can come to work here for a period, and our young people can go to Germany to work for a period. Where are we on that? Is there actually a conversation going on about that? Is it something that Germany would favour?
I would say all the 27 countries of the European Union would favour that. And I get very positive feedback also in this country, that many young people feel that this is something that through Brexit has been taken away from them. The possibility to live and to work in the European Union, to study there. And we would like to make that possible. But Trevor, I think very, very important that this is not mixed up in any way with migration policy or with freedom of movement. These would be relatively small numbers of people, of young people who would stay for a limited amount of time. Well, and we want to make this possible, yes.
Well, this is an issue, isn't it? Because our Prime Minister, when he was asked about this week, seemed to put the dampener on it because he doesn't want anybody to think that we're reintroducing labour mobility by the back door. Do you think, actually, such a thing could be made possible in practice?
Yeah, but I must say I agree with the Prime Minister. It's definitely not the intention to have freedom of movement through the back door. I think it can be done. Let's wait now. The next step will be the Prime Minister meeting the Commission President von der Leyen. We will have a new commission towards the end of the year, and then we will start talking about it, about a broad range of issues where we think that a reset is not only possible but necessary.
The last point, I just wanted to come back to the AfD. I mean, one of the features that we've seen is that perhaps these parties don't get into government, but what they do is perhaps change the position of the conventional parties. And we've seen in recent days a hardening of the centre-right CDU party and probably the German government. Is a real issue here that the advance of these parties will change the policy of the mainstream parties?
There is an element of that, Trevor. I would not deny that. But, you know, we also had a terrible terrorist attack by a Syrian refugee, which has highlighted the necessity that we need to be able to deport criminals who came among the asylum seekers. So we want, you know, what we need is really a possibility to deport those who have been criminal and to integrate the others. So we want to make both. And we just had yesterday, for the first time since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, we deported 28 Afghan criminals back to Kabul.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Trevor.
Next, we'll take a closer look at that rise of populism across Europe. Welcome back. I'm with our panel again now, Harriet Harman, Liam Fox and Vince Cable. Let's see what they made of that discussion about the far right in Germany and populism across Europe. Vince, here's the map again. Looking at that, if you go back to your time in government, could you have imagined this is what European politics was going to look like?
Well, to a degree. I actually wrote a book in 2009 saying that a predictable consequence of the financial crisis is we're going to get a rise in populism everywhere. But actually, looking at your map, the interesting bits are the ones that aren't coloured pink, because Spain, Greece, Portugal, the Scandinavian countries have all had populist parties, and they've receded. They've been better managed. In Sweden's case, it may be because they didn't accept this idea you've got to have a red line keeping these people out of government. But I think the other interesting thing about it is is this vocabulary about right and left doesn't quite work anymore. I mean, you've got these parties in East Germany we just heard about. One of them, the Sarah Wagenknecht party, I think.
It's a left-wing anti-immigration party.
Slovakia, Hungary, they are, nativist parties, but they're also, nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And Le Pen, who is very close to Putin. I mean, in a way, that's as worrying as the revival of the kind of politics of identity.
It's a good point about Spain and so on, though I suspect part of the reason for Spain and Greece is they have rather recent memories of living under very right-wing dictatorships. But Harriet, what do you make of this?
Well, I think, to be fair and to back up what Vince said, I think organisations like Hope Not Hate, who plot the rise and the threat posed by the far right, have warned about the seeds of this. And I think that it was very interesting what the German ambassador was saying is that, the rise of the far right breeds on dissatisfaction, disaffection, and people feeling not included and not having prospects for the future. And then the easy answer offered is one that provides no solutions at all, which is to scapegoat outsiders. So his focus on delivering, justice and fairness is incredibly important.
Liam?
Well, I think the first thing is don't blame the voters for what is happening. What you're looking at here is an indication of where the failure of the political mainstream has occurred and the failure to deal with the genuine anxieties of voters. That's one thing, and if you like, that's dealing with the symptoms, which is the problems of those coming legally and illegally into European countries. The second is the failure of the political mainstream to deal with the wider issue, which is there is a global migration crisis. What are the causes of the global migration crisis, and what, if anything, can we do to reduce those flows that are coming to us at the moment? Where it's like a doctor dealing with the symptoms but not dealing with the actual problem that underlies it. And so we need a much more grown-up conversation that looks at a global level about what can happen. Vince referred earlier to the protectionism that we've seen coming from the United States in recent years. That's mirrored and what's coming from Europe too. That's making it more difficult for those in developing countries to trade their way out of poverty. And if the West denies them that ability, we should not be surprised that they move as a consequence. We also need to control our legal migration in countries like the United Kingdom, where the biggest number, and therefore the biggest public anxiety, has been about the numbers legally allowed to come to the United Kingdom. And more importantly, and going to something of the point that Harriet made, is about the question of integration. We have to emphasise not just our differences, but our commonality. And if we only discuss our differences and not our commonality, we don't get differences, we get fragmentation and ghettoisation.
It's worth saying, though, that the Germans spent an awful lot of money. I think the last number I saw something like 20 billion euros a year on integration programmes. Language, housing, all of those kinds of things. And it doesn't entirely seem to have inoculated them against this.
Well, it may not have inoculated them, but actually the Merkel decision, which was extremely courageous in accepting a large number of Syrian refugees, was in its own terms very successful. Actually, their record of training, language, integration has actually been very good. But obviously there is a large chunk of the electorate who just don't buy it.
OK. We will talk about the budgets in just a moment, and we'll hear once again from our panel.
Martin Brunt, and I'm Sky's crime correspondent. My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please, please do not hurt her. Please give our little girl back.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
For detectives, the first 48 hours after a murder are crucial in the search for clues. The public expects them to find Jill Dando's killer soon. The British detectives are planning to meet forensic experts, academics, and even witch doctors.
I remember the grimmest case, the Soham murders of schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. I felt I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it.
Ian Huntley was arrested and charged within a fortnight of the murders.
I've never murdered anyone. I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for?
The parole board has to decide if Bronson needs to be kept locked up for the safety of the public. My biggest challenge was to persuade a jailed diamond thief to answer my letters. Martin Brunt, Sky News, at the Old Bailey.
Let's see what our panel's been making of our conversations this morning. We're joined by Harriet Harman, Liam Fox and Vince Cable. Look, the big story, I guess, for the next 2 months is going to be what will be in Rachel Reeves's budget. I think you all agree that there's going to have to be tax rises of some kind or another. And at the end of this conversation, I'll ask you which ones you favour. But let's go back to this chart here where, relatively speaking, we are a low-ish tax country, but one which expects high levels of public service. American tax, Scandinavian levels of public service. Is that actually sustainable for us, Harriet?
Well, I think there is also about how you run your public services and whether you run them efficiently. And one of the big opportunities we've got for public services working better and costing less of an increase is artificial intelligence. And so there's possibly a big change and an opportunity there that we need to seize. But I think one of the key things about tax is not just the overall amount, which you show in that graph, but also who is paying the tax and whether it's fair. Because, you know, there was that saying, you know, some American saying, taxes are just for little people. And the reality is that actually very well-off people pay a much lower percentage of their income in tax because of the way the tax system is structured. So to anticipate your question, what I'd like to see in the budget, I don't expect it will be in the budget, not this budget, but it's not right to continue a situation where you pay a higher tax on income from going to work than you pay on tax on income that comes from other means, like on capital or, you know, what's called unearned income. So I think that, you know, the public accounts...
Is this a bid for wealth taxes here, Harriet?
Well, I don't know actually what wealth taxes mean, but the system is unfair. And the Public Accounts Committee of the House of Commons, under the chairmanship of Margaret Hodge, showed that actually there was a whole load of corporations as well as individuals who were not paying their fair share. So we need to increase that graph, not on the backs of what Keir said, working people, but people who are in a position to contribute more and should.
Liam, you said we shouldn't ever blame the voters, but the voters potentially want something impossible.
Well, voters always want other people to pay more taxes. It's when you ask people, do they think should pay more tax, they say yes. But if you ask them, should you pay more tax, they'll say no. That's human nature, I think.
But do you agree, just sorry to butt in here, Liam, do you agree that actually it isn't right that because of their tax planning and tax arrangements, companies and very rich people pay a much lower percentage of their income on tax?
Well, the top 10% of earners now pay a higher proportion of total tax than ever before.
No, I'm talking about the percentage of their income.
But this is of course where one of the big divisions in politics come. Unless you allow people to make profits, to make money, to create jobs, you won't have the money for public services. If Labour do what they normally do, they will attack capital gains tax in this budget. They will make it more difficult for the wealth creators in the country to create wealth, and we'll get back to where we normally are, which is that every single Labour government since World War II has left office with higher unemployment than it inherited. It's going to happen again because their instincts are exactly the same.
Well, I think I put my cards on the table earlier on and accepted the fact that if you want a decent service economy, you've got to pay for it, and that does mean higher taxes. And unfortunately, there is a widespread belief in magic money trees, which don't exist. So I think we've just got to be hard-headed and realistic about this. I think if the government had been thinking more carefully about how you tax high earners, they wouldn't have got into this trouble with winter fuel allowance. I mean, the obvious thing was to tax it, right? I mean, people, you know, in high earnings are not going to notice that they're paying 40% tax on £300 a year. So, you know, tax it rather than axe it would have been a much more subtle and sensible way of dealing with it.
All right, let's by the way, just have a quick look at what the public thinks about what Labour's been doing. It won't be a massive surprise to you. The things that nobody really, frankly, understands very much and they think won't cost them anything, GB energy, onshore wind and all the rest of it, everybody likes. The stuff that they think is going to be a problem for them, winter fuel allowance, they don't like. Let me just, before we come to the end, ask you about actually what I think will turn out to be, in a way, the biggest dividing point. What do we protect? Some people think defence, we need to get to 2.5%. Some people think you can't do anything more on benefits and so on. If there is something that you think needed to be protected in this budget, what would it be, Liam?
Well, as a former Defence Secretary, you'll not be surprised. I believe that defence and security is the first duty of government. We live in a much more dangerous world. And I'm afraid that the concept of a peace dividend has gone out the window. And the government should pay for it by reducing the size of government.
Harriet, if you're going to protect something, what should Rachel Reeves?
Two things. I think they've got to protect the sums adding up. That is the most fundamental thing. And also, they've got to be sure they don't break the promises that they made in their manifesto. Everything has got to be built on those foundations. It's tough decisions within that, but they've got to keep on track with that.
Vince?
Well, I would prioritise child poverty. That's what I think. Actually, the two-child issue with universal credit was much more important than the winter fuel allowance in terms of poverty reduction, and I would have highlighted that.
OK. If you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can see it right there, you can listen to Harriet plus Beth Rigby on electoral dysfunction, the new podcast, also, of course, with Ruth Davidson. And the one thing I promised that I'd give you a chance to say 10 seconds on, your favourite tax rise.
Well, none are favourite, but I think the most easiest thing for them to do is fuel duty. The motorist lobby have said it's no problem, so just get on with it. And I think following that, inheritance taxes on property and land.
Yeah, that's 2 billion and I think 4 billion.
I don't believe in rising taxes. I want to see a shrinking state and shrinking taxes.
I'd say fairer taxes.
Fairer taxes?
Fairer taxes, which means that you actually tax income which doesn't come from people going out to work in the same way that you tax the ordinary person that goes out to work.
Thank you all very much. It's our first week back. I will be back next Sunday, but possibly not such a distinguished panel. But there you go. It's my pleasure to be back with you. Join us again, 8:30 next week.